Welcome back to Eyes on Israel. Tonight, Jews worldwide will begin the festival day of the final day of Passover. According to Jewish tradition, this festival, a few days after the Exodus from Egypt that we commemorated last week, recalls the miracle of the splitting of the Red Sea and the miraculous salvation of the children of Israel and the defeat of the Egyptian army. After the children of Israel journeyed for a few days out of Egypt, God commanded Moses to tell them to backtrack slightly and camp in a very specific location for a very specific purpose. Quote, "Speak to the children of Israel and let them turn back and camp before Pi Hachirot, between Migdol and the sea before Baal Zephon. You shall encamp opposite it by the sea. Pharaoh will say of the children of Israel, they are imprisoned, the Hebrew is nivuchim, in the land. The desert has locked them in. I shall strengthen the heart of Pharaoh, and he will pursue them, and I will be glorified through Pharaoh and his entire army, and Egypt will know that I am God." It's interesting that at the end of this passage, God told Moses that as a result of this plan, Egypt will finally know that he is God. Apparently, the 10 plagues, including the final death of the firstborn, had failed to convince the Egyptians of the supremacy of the God of Israel. What are the details of this plan? Let's sum up the content of the verses I just read. First, the children of Israel are told to travel backwards towards Egypt and camp opposite Baal Zephon. Upon hearing about this, Pharaoh will conclude that they are imprisoned, or nivuchim in the Hebrew, we'll get to that in a moment, in the land, and locked in by the desert. Emboldened by this conclusion, Pharaoh and his army will pursue the children of Israel and fall right into the trap that God has set for them. They will then learn once and for all that the Lord is God. Why there? Why that specific place? What's the purpose of this plan? The location where God wanted Israel to camp is very specific. The Bible doesn't generally give such detailed descriptions of locations. Yet here we have very precise coordinates. Before Pi Hachirot, between Migdol and the sea, before Baal Zephon, you shall camp opposite it by the sea. Once this very specific location at which Israel is to encamp is stated, the additional detail, quote, before Baal Zephon, seems superfluous. Haven't the directions been stated clearly enough? What is the importance of Baal Zephon? According to the plan, it seems the encampment of Israel at Baal Zephon specifically will cause Pharaoh to conclude that Israel's doomed. What is it about Baal Zephon that would lead Pharaoh to believe that? To believe that the God who decimated Egypt with the 10 plagues will not be able to save Israel from being imprisoned and locked in the desert? When God told Moses how Pharaoh would react to the news, he suggested that Pharaoh will say, quote, "They are imprisoned in the land and locked in by the desert." What exactly do these phrases mean, imprisoned in the land and locked in by the desert? Why not simply say that Israel is lost or stranded? Why did God suggest that this is what Pharaoh will say? Furthermore, what's the connection between these unusual phrases and Baal Zephon? Finally, God said that at the end of this plan, the Egyptians will finally know that I am God. The question here is obvious. If the 10 plagues, and especially the final plague of the firstborn, didn't teach the Egyptians to believe in God, why do we think that this plan will? Jewish tradition teaches that the 10 plagues successfully destroyed all the false gods of Egypt except for one, Baal Zephon. That's the name of a god. Now, what is it about Baal Zephon, this god, that left it unchallenged by all the miraculous signs and wonders that God had done in Egypt? Who's Baal Zephon? The meaning of the name Baal Zephon is pretty easy to figure out. The prefix Baal tells us that we're dealing with a pagan god. Biblical text is replete with references to various Baals or pagan gods. Baal Zebub, Baal Peor, the Baalim, the plural of Baal, are just a few examples that you see in the Bible. The Hebrew word Baal literally translates as master, lord, or owner. And the word Zephon is the Hebrew word for north. So a precise translation of the name of the god Baal Zephon would be Lord of the North, or North Lord. Now, amazingly, the Egyptian Book of the Dead, the ancient Egyptian religious text, mentions a prominent god known as Lord of the Northern Sky, almost a perfect translation of the Hebrew Baal Zephon. This god's Egyptian name was Set. Set was the patron deity of northern Egypt and was believed to be responsible for fierce desert storms. Interesting. According to ancient Egyptian mythology, Set had murdered his brother and attempted to kill his nephew, Horus. For doing this, Set was cast out of the family into the desert alone for eternity. But at a later stage in the 19th dynasty of Egypt, that's the period of Israel's enslavement, there was a resurgence of reverence for Set, and he was seen as a great god, the god who benevolently restrained the forces of the desert and protected Egypt from foreigners coming through the desert. So let's put this together now. Set is responsible for desert storms, the sea, and preventing escape. Set personified the powers of darkness, chaos, and the sea waters that resisted light and order. The prominent 19th century Egyptologist, Dr. Heinrich Brugsch, asserts that from the standpoint of an Egyptian in Upper Egypt, the north was rightly considered to be the place of darkness, cold, mist, and rain, all of which were attributed to Set, and that the Hebrews called this region the region of darkness, or the winter hemisphere, and they called it Tsephon, a name which appears to be connected beyond a doubt with Safon, the north. As for Jewish sources, Rabbi Abraham ibn Ezra from the 11th century wrote that Baal Zephon was believed to have the power to prevent slaves from escaping Egypt. In light of all of the above, the tradition that Baal Zephon was the only remaining Egyptian god actually makes a lot of sense. Baal Zephon's dominion was not in Egypt, but out in the desert. The 10 plagues took place in Egypt itself. So now let's review God's plan. He said, "Speak to the children of Israel and let them turn back and encamp before Pi-hahirot, between Migdol and the sea, before Baal Zephon. You shall encamp opposite it by the sea." So God specifically told Israel to encamp opposite Baal Zephon by the sea. Let's remember that Baal Zephon was believed to control the water of the sea. And then the Bible goes on to say that Pharaoh will say of the children of Israel, they are imprisoned. Literally, the Hebrew says, nivuchim, in the land. The desert has locked them in. We'll get to that word in a moment. Hearing that Israel were stopped at Baal Zephon, Pharaoh would conclude that Baal Zephon had trapped them. The odd word choice, they are imprisoned, nivuchim, in the land, the desert has locked them in, can now be fully explained. The Hebrew word nivuchim is not usually translated as imprisoned. The actual translation of this word is perplexed, depressed, or confused. One ancient Aramaic translation renders nivuchim as metarfim, which means crazy. If Pharaoh believed that Israel had fallen into the clutches of Baal Zephon, the god responsible for chaos, darkness, and desert storms, describing Israel as nivuchim would be an accurate way of saying that Baal Zephon has captured them. The second phrase in Pharaoh's suggested reaction is, in Hebrew, sagar alehem hamidbar, the desert has locked them in. But an equally precise translation would be, he has locked the desert upon them. In other words, Pharaoh believed that Baal Zephon had trapped the children of Israel in the desert. This understanding is consistent with the ancient Aramaic rendering of Pharaoh's reaction. Quote, "The nation of the house of Israel is crazy in the land. The god Zephon, master of the desert, has caused them difficulty." This is from an Aramaic translation of the Bible that's about 2,000 years old. So let's sum up the entire plan now. God led Pharaoh to believe that Baal Zephon had successfully defied the God of Israel, Emboldened by this idea, Pharaoh will then rush out into the desert to defeat Israel in the presence of Baal-zephon, over whom the God of Israel apparently had no power. Thus, the stage was set for the refutation of the final god of Egypt, and with it, all of Egyptian paganism. With the escaping slaves camped right in front of Baal-zephon, the Egyptian god of storms, chaos, and water, the God who prevents slaves from escaping, was refuted by a storm so orderly that it actually split the water, miraculously forming two walls. Storms, chaos, and water were all clearly shown to be fully under God's control, not Baal-zephon. The splitting of the Red Sea is the greatest miracle of the Exodus story. Not because it was a greater deviation from the laws of nature than, for example, the plague of blood. The splitting of the sea is the greatest miracle, the cause of the great song of praise that Israel sings to God, because through it, Egypt and Israel knew finally and without a shadow of a doubt that I am the Lord. Thank you for watching Eyes on Israel, and may you have a joyous and festive final day of Passover.